Autumn 1941. The golden sands of North Africa shimmered under the scorching sun as the desert war reached its fiercest phase. For months, British and Commonwealth pilots had dominated the skies, dueling outdated Italian biplanes and underpowered monoplanes with ease. The Fiat CR-42 Falco, with its open cockpit and fabric wings, was no match for the Spitfire or Hurricane. Even the Fiat G50, once considered modern, was slow, poorly armed, and badly suited for desert conditions. The Royal Air Force viewed the Italian Regia Aeronautica as brave but backward, courageous pilots trapped in obsolete machines. Then, one afternoon over Tobruk, that perception changed forever. A patrol of RAF Hurricanes encountered a flight of sleek, camouflaged fighters with a distinctly different silhouette. Their lines were elegant and predatory, their engines emitting a deep, confident growl. The British pilots assumed at first that they had stumbled upon new German Bf-109s supporting the Afrika Korps. But when they finally saw the tricolour markings on the wings, green, white, and red, disbelief swept through the formation. These weren't Germans. They were Italians. The new aircraft was the Macchi C.202 Folgore. Lightning. Fast, agile, and graceful, it was everything Italian aircraft had never been before. Powered by a license-built Daimler-Benz DB601A engine, the same heart that beat within Germany's Messerschmitt Bf-109E, the Folgore could reach 600 km per hour, matching the RAF's latest Spitfire MKV in both speed and climb. It was the product of a quiet revolution inside Italian aviation, one driven not by politics or propaganda, but by engineering genius and desperate necessity. The man behind it was Mario Castoldi, chief designer at the Macchi Company. A veteran of Italy's golden age of racing seaplanes, Castoldi had spent years perfecting the art of aerodynamic elegance. His racing floatplanes of the 1930s, like the Macchi M39 and MC 72, had broken world speed records and embodied Italy's flair for beauty and performance. But when war came, his talents were redirected from sport to survival. By 1940, the Regia Aeronautica was losing the air war badly. Its outdated designs, like the CR-42 and the early G50, were no match for British aircraft. Castoldi knew Italy needed something entirely new, a fighter that could stand shoulder to shoulder with the best of Germany and Britain. He began reworking his earlier Macchi C.200 Saetta, a rugged but underpowered radial engine fighter, around a liquid-cooled inline engine. The result was a masterpiece. The Macchi C.202 combined Italian artistry with German technology. Its slim fuselage reduced drag to the absolute minimum, while its elliptical wings gave it superb maneuverability. The cockpit, though cramped, offered excellent visibility, and the airframe could withstand remarkable stress. Most importantly, the new inline engine transformed its performance. The Folgore could dive faster than almost any Allied fighter, and its acceleration left opponents stunned. In the early encounters of late 1941, RAF pilots were caught completely off guard. Reports from No. 2 and S-74 Squadron, operating Hurricanes in the Western Desert, described the new Italian plane as the best enemy fighter we have yet seen. Dogfights that had once been routine victories turned into desperate struggles. The Folgore could climb away with ease, roll sharply to evade gunfire, and meet the British head-on without fear. What shocked the Allies most was how the Italians fought. Gone was the hesitant, disorganized flying that had characterized the early war years. The pilots of the Regia Aeronautica, now flying the Folgore, displayed coordination, aggression, and precision. They attacked in disciplined formations, exploiting the Folgore's strengths, speed, agility, and dive capability. British pilots soon began referring to them as the Desert Devils. I diavoli del deserto. For the Italians, it was a moment of pride and vindication. After years of ridicule, they were finally feared. The desert, once a graveyard for Italian airmen, became their proving ground. The Folgore's design was breathtakingly beautiful, almost poetic in its symmetry. Yet behind the elegance was deadly efficiency. The engine, produced under license by Alfa Romeo, gave 1,175 horsepower. enough to propel the aircraft to nearly 370 platabres. Its handling characteristics were described as exquisite. The aircraft responded to the pilot's touch with the fluidity of a sports car, allowing tight turns and precise maneuvers even at high speed. But the Folgore's armament was its Achilles heel. Most early models carried only two 12.7mm Breda Safat machine guns mounted in the nose. Against bombers or armoured aircraft, that firepower was insufficient. Later versions added two wing-mounted 7.7mm guns, but even then, it remained underarmed compared to the Spitfire or Messerschmitt. Still, in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was a lethal dueling weapon. Italian aces like Franco Lucchini, Leonardo Ferrulli, and Furio Nicolo Doglio used the Folgore to devastating effect, claiming dozens of victories across the desert front. Their tactics relied on surprise, speed, and disciplined teamwork. A far cry from the chaotic individualism of earlier Italian air battles. By early 1942, British intelligence reports were forced to admit the truth. One confidential RAF analysis stated bluntly, "The Folgore is a first-class fighter. Fast, agile, and deadly in skilled hands. It should not be underestimated." From that point on, the Regia Aeronautica was no longer a laughingstock. The transformation was so profound that even German commanders began to take notice. Luftwaffe officers who had once dismissed their Italian allies as inferior now praised the Folgore as one of the most refined fighters on the Axis side. Some even compared its handling to that of the Bf 109F, a remarkable compliment. Yet the success of the Macchi C.202 came at a cost. Italy's industry simply could not produce it in large numbers. The country lacked aluminum, precision tools, and reliable fuel supplies. Factories were bombed, resources were scarce, and transport across the Mediterranean was constantly threatened by Allied naval power. Even at its production peak, Italy could only deliver a few dozen aircraft per month. Many were assembled with varying quality, depending on the availability of materials. Some engines overheated due to poor cooling systems, and maintenance in desert conditions proved difficult. Spare parts were often cannibalized from wrecks. Despite these hardships, the Folgore squadrons fought with astonishing determination. Their bases at Martuba, El Adem, and Castelbenito became home to an elite brotherhood of pilots who knew their chances of survival were slim, yet flew daily into overwhelming odds. They fought alongside the German Afrika Korps, escorting Stukas and bombers over the front lines, dueling with the Desert Air Force in swirling battles above the dunes. Many British pilots, upon encountering a Folgore, mistook it for a German plane and were surprised to find Italian markings after the fight. For the men who flew it, the Folgore represented more than a machine. It was a symbol of redemption. It proved that Italian engineering could rival that of any nation, and that courage could still shine even in a losing war. As the desert campaign intensified, the Folgore's reputation grew. RAF pilots began to respect, even admire their opponents. Some described the aircraft as the most beautiful fighter of the war. Others called it the Italian Spitfire. But behind the glory lay tragedy. The pilots of the Regia Aeronautica knew they were fighting for a cause that was crumbling. Supplies dwindled, fuel ran out, and by late 1942, as Rommel's forces retreated from El Alamein, many Folgores were abandoned in the sand, destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Still, even in defeat, the legend endured. The Folgore had done the impossible. It had restored honor to the Italian Air Force and earned the respect of its enemies. By the beginning of 1943, the Macchi C.202 Folgore had already become a legend among pilots, both friend and foe. For the Italians, it symbolized a fleeting moment of excellence, a spark of brilliance that cut through the gloom of war and national decline. For the Allies, it was a reminder that underestimating one's enemy could be fatal. In the skies over Tunisia and Libya, the Folgore continued to fight even as the Axis position collapsed. The Regia Aeronautica was worn thin, outnumbered and outgunned, yet its pilots refused to yield. The few remaining Folgores, often patched together from spare parts, their engines choking on desert dust, were flown daily against massive Allied formations. What kept these men going was pride. The Folgore had given Italian pilots something they had lacked since 1940, belief in themselves. "When we flew the C.202," one veteran later recalled, "we no longer felt like poor cousins of the Luftwaffe. We were equals." It wasn't an exaggeration. In combat, the Folgore could hold its own even against the formidable Spitfire Mk5 and the American P-40 Warhawk. In level flight, it was as fast as either. In a dive, it was faster. Its controls remained responsive at high speeds, and it could outturn both in a tight dogfight. Only in firepower did it lag behind, and even that the Italians made up for with precision shooting. British ace Neville Duke, who later tested captured Folgores after the war, was deeply impressed. He described it as beautifully balanced, with light controls and delightful handling. Another RAF test pilot noted that it felt alive, like an extension of the pilot himself. But for all its grace and performance, the Folgore was trapped by Italy's limitations. Unlike Britain or the United States, Italy lacked the industrial infrastructure to mass-produce complex fighters. Every Folgore built was almost a work of art, hand-fitted, meticulously assembled, and therefore slow to manufacture. In total, just over 1,150 Macchi C.202s were built between 1941 and 1943, a pitiful number compared to the tens of thousands of Allied fighters rolling off assembly lines every month. The contrast was staggering. While the Americans produced a new P-51 Mustang every 66 minutes, it took Italian factories days to complete a single Folgore. And yet, each one that reached the front carried with it the hopes of the Regia Aeronautica. The aircraft's construction revealed much about Italian priorities. The fuselage was made of lightweight aluminum alloy, its lines flowing seamlessly from spinner to tail. The cockpit was small and Spartan, cramped for larger pilots, but provided excellent forward visibility thanks to the narrow engine cowling. The landing gear retracted inward, giving the aircraft a wide stance and good stability during takeoff and landing. The Folgore's camouflage, too, reflected Italian ingenuity. The mottled desert paint schemes, irregular patches of brown, sand, and green, blended perfectly into the North African landscape. Allied pilots often remarked how difficult it was to spot a Folgore approaching head-on. Its slim profile and shimmering desert tones made it nearly invisible until it was too late. One of the aircraft's most dangerous features, however, was its ability to dive. The Folgore could reach astonishing speeds in a dive, over 800 kilometers per hour, without losing control. Many RAF pilots learned too late that attempting to follow an Italian fighter into a steep descent was suicidal. The Hurricane's fabric wings simply couldn't handle the stress. Italian ace Franco Lucchini used this tactic to perfection. In one engagement near Bir Hakeim, Lucchini led a flight of Folgores against a formation of P-40s escorting bombers. Outnumbered 2-1, he ordered his men to climb high into the sun, then dive at full throttle. Their speed was so great that the American pilots couldn't react in time. Within seconds, 3 P-40s were downed, and the rest scattered. Lucchini's unit returned to base without a single loss. Such victories gave the Italians an almost mythical aura. For a brief, shining moment, the Diavoli del Deserto truly ruled the skies. But victory in the air could not change the course of the war. By late 1942, the Axis forces in North Africa were in retreat. El Alamein had broken Rommel's offensive, and Allied air superiority became overwhelming. American bombers and British fighter bombers filled the skies, their numbers beyond comprehension. Even the best Italian pilots found themselves fighting against impossible odds. Fuel shortages became catastrophic. Some squadrons had enough gasoline for only a handful of sorties each week. Spare parts were non-existent. Mechanics cannibalized wrecked aircraft just to keep a few flying. In these desperate months, the Folgore became a symbol of defiance. Pilots knew they couldn't win, but they could still fight. One of the most dramatic episodes occurred in February 1943, when a group of 9 Folgores from Fordoggio Stormo intercepted a formation of Allied bombers headed for Tunis. Outnumbered more than 10-1, they attacked head-on, slicing through the defensive fire with reckless courage. They managed to shoot down 3 bombers before being overwhelmed. Only 2 Folgores returned to base. Both were riddled with holes, their pilots wounded. Yet the spirit of the sortie became legendary among Italian airmen, the final flash of lightning in a darkening sky. Meanwhile, in Italy itself, the situation worsened. Allied bombers targeted industrial centres, crippling production. The Macchi factories in Lombardy and Varese were hit repeatedly, halting output of the Folgore. Engineers tried to improve the design further by installing the more powerful Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, creating the Macchi C.202 Veltro, Greyhound. But by the time it reached combat, it was too late. Still, many Italian pilots considered the Folgore their true aircraft, elegant, responsive, and perfectly balanced. The C.205 was faster, one veteran later said, but the C.202 was pure joy to fly. It was alive. As Italy's war effort collapsed in 1943, the Regia Aeronautica split in 2. After the armistice in September, some pilots joined the Allied co-belligerent air force, while others continued fighting for the German-backed Italian Social Republic in the north. Folgores flew on both sides, brothers facing brothers in the same aircraft, a tragic mirror of Italy's own civil war. Captured Folgores were also used by the Luftwaffe and by Croatian and Hungarian units. Even the Allies, curious about the Italian design, captured several intact examples for testing. British and American engineers were astonished by its craftsmanship. One report from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough described it as an aircraft of remarkable aerodynamic refinement, combining simplicity with elegance. But those words, however flattering, were written long after the Folgore's moment had passed. By 1944, Italy was in ruins. The skies that had once echoed with the roar of the Folgore were now dominated by swarms of Allied bombers and fighters. The Regia Aeronautica, or what remained of it, could do little but resist with dwindling strength. Still, in the memories of those who had flown her, the Folgore remained untarnished. It represented the very best of Italy's aviation spirit, beauty, courage, and the pursuit of perfection, even in the face of inevitable defeat. The British historian Christopher Shawes later wrote, "For a brief time, the Italian Air Force possessed a fighter as fine as any in the world. The Folgore was proof that courage and creativity could flourish even amid ruin." Today, only a handful of Macchi C.202s survive in museums, silent witnesses to a forgotten chapter of World War II. Their polished metal gleams softly under artificial lights, their elegant lines preserved like the memory of a vanished age. Visitors who stand before them often remark on their beauty, unaware of the blood and bravery behind that perfection. But to those who know the story, the engineers who built them with bare hands, the pilots who flew them against impossible odds, the Folgore remains more than a machine. It is a symbol of transformation. A story of how a nation mocked for weakness could, for one fleeting moment, produce something extraordinary. A lightning bolt that blazed across the desert sky and burned its name into history. The legend of the Macchi C.202 Folgore was born not only in the deserts of North Africa, but also in the hearts of the men who flew her. For the pilots of the Regia Aeronautica, the aircraft was more than a weapon. It was an affirmation of dignity. It represented the idea that even as Italy's army stumbled and its leaders faltered, its engineers and aviators could still achieve greatness. In 1941, when the Folgore first appeared, Italian aviation was in a desperate state. Years of poor planning, limited industrial capacity, and outdated doctrine had left the Air Force lagging far behind its adversaries. The early war years had been humiliating. Italian pilots faced British and French fighters with obsolete biplanes, sometimes even without radios or modern gun sights. Many had perished bravely, but uselessly. The introduction of the C.202 changed all that almost overnight. The psychological effect it had on both sides cannot be overstated. British intelligence officers were stunned when they began to examine wrecked examples of the new fighter. Reports from Cairo intelligence headquarters in late 1941 described the Folgore's airframe as a vast improvement over any previous Italian machine, showing attention to detail and precision craftsmanship of the highest order. The British had expected crude rivets, poor fittings, and shoddy metalwork. Instead, they found an aircraft built with meticulous care. The skin joints were smooth. The rivet work was tight and uniform. Even the cockpit layout was logical and efficient. It was, one officer remarked, an Italian thoroughbred with German muscle. The irony was that the Folgore existed precisely because of Italy's alliance with Germany. Without access to the Daimler-Benz DB601 engine, or rather, the license to produce it under the Alfa Romeo brand, Italy could never have built such an aircraft. But while Germany provided the technology, Italy provided the soul. Mario Castoldi's design philosophy was rooted in simplicity and aerodynamic purity. His earlier C.200 Saetta had already demonstrated his ability to create stable, forgiving aircraft. The Folgore took that concept and refined it to perfection. Castoldi paid obsessive attention to airflow, eliminating drag wherever possible. The fuselage was sleek, the wing roots carefully blended into the body, and even the radiator intake beneath the engine was shaped for minimal resistance. Italian test pilots who first flew the prototype in early 1940 were astonished. One of them, Captain Guido Carestiato, later recalled, "It felt alive, like it wanted to fly by itself. It climbed like an angel and rolled like a dancer." The Regia Aeronautica approved the design immediately. Production began in 1941, though at first only in small numbers due to shortages of engines and materials. The first operational Folgores were delivered to the First-Gran Stormo Caccia Terrestre, based in Sicily. Their baptism of fire came over Malta, where the RAF controlled the skies with Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Italian pilots quickly proved that they could match their opponents. Dogfights over the island became evenly balanced affairs, something that had been unthinkable just a year earlier. RAF pilots began sending reports back to headquarters, warning that a new, dangerous enemy fighter had appeared. From Malta, the Folgore squadrons were soon redeployed to Libya and Egypt, where Rommel's Africa Corps was advancing. Here, the aircraft truly came into its own. The wide-open skies and endless horizon of the desert suited its strengths perfectly. Its engine performed well in the dry air, and its excellent cooling system resisted overheating even under the brutal North African sun. One British observer described seeing a group of Folgores taking off from an airfield near Benghazi. They rose in perfect formation, 3 pairs at a time, each aircraft shimmering in the heat haze like a mirage. When they turned toward us, their camouflage vanished into the sand. A moment later, they were gone. Only the sound of engines remained. This was the essence of the Folgore: stealth, elegance, and speed. Many Italian aces who earned fame in the desert began their careers in these aircraft. Franco Lucchini, one of Italy's top scorers, flew the Folgore with 10-degree Gruppo and achieved dozens of victories before his death in 1943. His tactics were simple but deadly. Climb high, attack with surprise, and never get drawn into a turning fight unless you were sure of your advantage. Lucchini's comrade, Luigi Guarini, described how they used teamwork to overcome their numerical inferiority. "We flew as one. When the British came, we attacked in pairs, like wolves. One drew the enemy's fire, while the other struck from above." The Folgore responded instantly. It was like fencing with a rapier. Even the Germans were impressed. Luftwaffe ace Hans-Joachim Marseille, who had initially mocked the Italians, later praised their flying skill once they received the C.202. "They fight with courage and elegance," he said. "That Italian fighter, it dances in the air." By mid-1942, the Folgore was the pride of the Axis forces in Africa. It was fast, nimble, and visually stunning, its long nose, smooth canopy, and narrow wings giving it the look of a predator. It was also extremely reliable mechanically, a rarity for Italian machines. Allied intelligence reports frequently noted how few Folgores were lost to engine failure compared to earlier types. However, the aircraft's weak armament remained a constant frustration. The two heavy machine guns in the nose were synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, but their rate of fire and punch were insufficient against heavy bombers. Some late models mounted two additional light machine guns in the wings, but these were barely adequate. Italian pilots compensated by getting extremely close to their targets, sometimes within 100 meters, before opening fire. This habit led to terrifying encounters. Pilots often returned to base with fragments of their targets embedded in their wings or radiators. Yet they considered it a point of honor to destroy the enemy at close range. Another limitation was range. The Folgore's fuel capacity restricted it to missions of less than 2 hours, meaning Italian pilots often fought with little margin for error. Many were forced to make emergency landings in the desert after running out of fuel, surviving for days before rescue. Nevertheless, the Folgore's record remained remarkable. Between 1941 and 1943, the Regia Aeronautica claimed hundreds of Allied aircraft destroyed, most of them in combat with the Desert Air Force. While post-war research suggests that both sides exaggerated their kill counts, the respect was mutual. RAF intelligence reports began including special instructions on how to identify and counter the Folgore, noting that it is superior to the Hurricane and equal to the Spitfire in most respects. For Italy, this was a stunning reversal. Only a year before, its aircraft had been derided as obsolete relics. Now, its fighters were being compared to the best in the world. But success on the battlefield could not overcome the collapse of the nation behind it. Italy's economy was crumbling under the weight of the war. Its industry lacked fuel, raw materials, and manpower. Even the Folgore's DB601 engines had to be rationed, as the German High Command prioritized its own production. By the time of the Allied landings in North Africa, in late 1942, only a handful of Folgore squadrons remained fully operational. Many were forced to fight until their aircraft literally fell apart. Mechanics patched bullet holes with tin and canvas. Engines were kept running long past their service limits. The men who flew them called themselves the last lightning bolts. When the Axis front finally collapsed in Tunisia in 1943, scores of Folgores were left behind. Some were captured intact, their elegant forms half buried in sand. Allied engineers swarmed over them, eager to study the mysterious new Italian fighter. What they found confirmed what their pilots had been saying for months. The Folgore was an engineering masterpiece. One British report concluded, "The C.202 is a fine combat aircraft, on par with the best Allied designs. Its aerodynamic efficiency and performance demonstrate a level of technical sophistication not previously associated with Italian production." But by then, the Folgore's time had already passed. Italy was collapsing, its factories bombed, its morale shattered. The new C-205 Veltro would soon take its place, but the magic of the Folgore, that first flash of brilliance, would never be repeated. And yet, even in its twilight, the aircraft remained a symbol of national pride. Pilots continued to polish their machines, painting personal emblems and names on the fuselage. Fulmine di Roma, Diana, Spada del Cielo. They believed that as long as one Folgore remained in the air, Italy still had honor. That belief would carry them through the darkest days to come. By mid-1943, the Macchi C.202 Folgore was nearing the end of its journey. Yet even as Italy's war effort crumbled, the aircraft continued to fight bravely in the hands of men who refused to surrender their skies. For these pilots, the Folgore was not merely a fighter. It was a companion, a symbol of the courage and craftsmanship that still endured amid the ruins of Mussolini's empire. When Allied forces invaded Sicily in July 1943, the Regia Aeronautica deployed its remaining Folgores to defend the homeland. The air battles over Sicily and southern Italy were among the most desperate of the war. Against swarms of Spitfires, P-38 Lightnings, and P-40 Warhawks, the Folgore pilots faced overwhelming odds. But they fought on, often launching 2 or 3 sorties a day despite fuel shortages and collapsing infrastructure. One of those pilots was Sergeant Ennio Tarantola, who flew with 50th Vendaglia Stormo. His recollections, preserved in post-war interviews, capture the atmosphere of those final months. We were exhausted, hungry, and half-beaten already. But when I strapped into my Folgore, all of that disappeared. The moment the engine came alive, the world made sense again. She was light under my hands, fast and faithful. For those minutes in the sky, I felt free. That sentiment echoed through the ranks of the Regia Aeronautica. The Folgore inspired affection in a way few machines ever could. Its balance, its responsiveness, even its aesthetic beauty, gave pilots the feeling that they were flying something alive. In a world consumed by destruction, the Folgore was an artifact of grace. Yet grace could not stop bombs. Allied attacks on airfields and factories intensified during 1943. The main Macchi plants at Varese and Lonate Pozzolo were repeatedly bombed, disrupting production. Italy's fuel supply was virtually gone. Many Folgores sat grounded, their engines dry, their tires flat in the dust. As Italy's government collapsed in September 1943, chaos spread through every branch of the military. On September 8th, the Italian armistice with the Allies was announced. A moment that shattered the nation's soul. Overnight, former allies became enemies. The Regia Aeronautica splintered. Some units joined the new Allied-backed co-belligerent Air Force in the south, while others swore loyalty to the German-controlled Italian Social Republic in the north. In a tragic twist, Folgore pilots found themselves fighting each other. The same aircraft, the same markings, even the same sense of pride. But now on opposite sides of the front. One pilot, Lieutenant Giacomo Metelli, later described the moment he realized he was fighting another Italian. "We saw two C.202s climbing toward us from the opposite direction. At first, I thought they were friends. Then they fired. I could hardly believe it. Italian lightning against Italian lightning. It was as if the sky itself had gone mad." The Germans, recognizing the value of the Folgore, requisitioned many surviving aircraft for their own use. Luftwaffe units used them for training, reconnaissance, and even frontline defense in northern Italy and the Balkans. To German pilots, accustomed to the brutish power of the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf, the Folgore felt like an elegant sport plane, light, precise, and graceful. Meanwhile, the Allies tested captured examples in their own wind tunnels and airfields. American engineers at Wright Field, Ohio, studied the aircraft's aerodynamics in detail. Their reports concluded that the Folgore possessed exceptional aerodynamic cleanliness and superior rolling performance, even comparing its design efficiency to early P-51 prototypes. One U.S. test pilot wrote, "If the Italians had the resources to build these in numbers, we'd have faced a far tougher enemy in the Mediterranean." That statement, though hypothetical, captures the tragedy of Italian aviation during World War II. Brilliance strangled by scarcity. In the north, production limped on under German supervision. The Aeronautica Nazionale Repubblicana, AANR, the air arm of Mussolini's puppet regime, continued to fly Folgores well into 1944. These squadrons operated mainly in defense of northern industrial centers like Milan and Turin, attempting to intercept Allied bombers that poured over the Alps. It was a hopeless mission. The bombers flew in massive formations, escorted by waves of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. The Folgores, outnumbered 20-1, climbed to meet them anyway. Records from Verstegreen Gruppo Caccia show numerous engagements where small flights of Folgores attacked American bomber streams at suicidal odds. Their light armament made it difficult to inflict serious damage on B-17s or B-24s, but their courage was unquestionable. On more than one occasion, Italian pilots rammed their opponents when their guns jammed or ammunition ran out. One such pilot, Sergeant Carlo Maurizio, collided head-on with a B-24 over Turin in 1944. Both aircraft were destroyed. His squadron mates found a piece of his Folgore's fuselage weeks later, bearing the painted name Speranza, hope. In these final battles, the Folgore story reached its tragic crescendo. It was no longer a symbol of technological triumph, but of defiant resistance, a relic of a vanished dream. The aircraft that had once dazzled the desert now fought amid the smoke and rubble of its homeland. Yet even in defeat, the Folgore retained its mystique. Allied pilots who faced it over Italy often remarked on its striking appearance. Against the dull olive and grey of modern warplanes, the Folgore's sand-yellow camouflage and elegant curves seemed almost artistic. One American pilot called it the Ferrari of fighters. That comparison wasn't far off. Like a Ferrari, the Folgore combined speed and beauty with fragility and exclusivity. It was not a machine for mass warfare. It was a craftsman's masterpiece. Every rivet, every curve was shaped by hand. And like all works of art, its perfection came at the cost of practicality. In terms of raw statistics, the Folgore's performance remained competitive until the very end. Its top speed of 372 miles per hour, climb rate of 3,500 feet per minute, and tight turning circle made it dangerous even against late-war Allied fighters. But by 1944, aerial combat had changed. Battles were fought at higher altitudes and longer ranges, favoring planes with heavier armament, radar guidance, and long-range capability. The Folgore belonged to an earlier, more personal era. The age of the dogfight. When the war finally ended in 1945, only a few Folgores were still flying. Most had been destroyed in combat or scrapped for parts. Those that survived were taken by Allied forces as trophies or research subjects. A handful found new life in post-war air forces. 1 or 2 were used by the Egyptian Air Force, others by Croatian and Yugoslav units during the chaotic aftermath of the war. But their days of glory were over. For the men who had flown them, however, the Folgore never died. Veterans spoke of it in reverent tones for decades after the war. In memoirs, interviews, and reunions, they described not just its performance, but the emotional bond they had felt with the aircraft. Colonel Luigi Gorini, who went on to become Italy's highest-scoring living ace, said in 1988, "When I flew the Folgore, I forgot hunger, fear, and politics. She was alive, not metal, but spirit. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel her heartbeat through the controls." It was a sentiment echoed by pilots on both sides of the conflict. British and American flyers who had faced the Folgore often admitted their admiration for it. Some even confessed that, had they been Italian, they would have been proud to fly such an aircraft. And perhaps that is the ultimate legacy of the Macchi C.202. It began as an attempt to erase humiliation, to give a battered nation something to believe in. But in doing so, it transcended politics and propaganda. The Folgore became a symbol of pure aeronautical beauty, of what human hands can achieve even in the darkest times. Today, when historians write about World War II aviation, the Folgore rarely appears alongside the Spitfire, Mustang, or Messerschmitt. Its story is quieter, its fame dimmed by the shadow of Italy's defeat. But for those who know, the engineers, the restorers, the few surviving pilots, it remains one of the most extraordinary fighters ever built. The lightning that flashed across the desert skies may have faded, but its echo still hums in the hearts of all who remember it. In the aftermath of the war, when Italy lay in ruins and its industries in ashes, the Macchi C.202 Folgore remained a bittersweet memory, a relic of what might have been. Its production had ceased long before the final surrender, but its legend continued to live on, whispered in the hangars and veterans' gatherings of the post-war years. For the engineers and pilots who had worked with it, the Folgore represented the high point of Italian aviation. Despite the defeat, it was proof that Italian design could stand beside, and sometimes surpass, the best the world had to offer. The Folgore embodied that distinct Italian combination of beauty, precision, and soul, qualities that would later define the nation's post-war industries, from automobiles to fashion. In the late 1940s, a few surviving C.202s were gathered by what remained of the Aeronautica Militare, Italy's new Republican Air Force. Though outdated by modern standards, they were still flown for training and liaison duties. Mechanics treated them with the same reverence one might reserve for a racing car. Careful, deliberate, proud. Every time one of those aircraft took off, the people on the ground would stop and look up. They were not just watching a flight. They were watching the last lightning bolts of an era. But the Folgore's true afterlife began not in the air, but in the imagination. Historians, model builders, and aviation enthusiasts across Europe and the Americas became fascinated by the Italian fighter. There was something irresistibly romantic about its story. A creation born in adversity, beautiful but doomed, admired even by its enemies. In aviation museums from Rome to Belgrade to Washington, surviving airframes were restored with painstaking care. Each rivet, each curve, was polished to recall the days when this aircraft had sliced through the desert sky like a blade of light. One of the most famous surviving examples resides in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Captured in North Africa and brought to the United States in 1943, it was carefully studied and later preserved. Today, visitors can still see its elegant lines and sand-colored camouflage, a silent testament to Italian craftsmanship. The restoration teams who worked on it decades later spoke of their admiration for the design. "Every piece was handmade," one curator said. "You can see the human touch everywhere. The careful rivet work, the subtle curves, the artistry in the metal. This was not mass production. It was sculpture that could fly." That sense of artistry is what makes the Folgore's story so haunting. It was a weapon of war, yes, but it carried the fingerprints of artisans, men who built aircraft as if they were creating works of art. And in a sense, they were. For Mario Castoldi, the aircraft's designer, the Folgore marked the culmination of a lifetime devoted to flight. Born in 1888, Castoldi had grown up in the dawn of aviation. Before the war, he had designed some of the fastest racing seaplanes in history, including the Macchi C.202, which set a world speed record in 1934 that stood for nearly 30 years. The Folgore was his attempt to bring that same elegance and efficiency to a machine of war. After 1945, Castoldi retired quietly, rarely giving interviews. He never spoke much about his wartime designs, but colleagues said he remained proud of the Folgore. He considered it his most perfect creation, one engineer later wrote. "Not the fastest, not the strongest, but the most harmonious. Every line had purpose. Every curve sang." The aircraft's aesthetic perfection even influenced later generations of designers. Post-war Italian jets, such as the Fiat G91 and the Air for Sagittario, carried echoes of the Folgore's balance and simplicity. The spirit of the Lightning lived on, disguised beneath swept wings and jet intakes. For the pilots, the memory of flying the C.202 became something sacred. They gathered in veterans' associations, holding reunions well into the 1970s and 80s. At these meetings, they would wear their old flight jackets, pass around black and white photographs, and tell stories that blurred the line between myth and memory. One pilot recalled a night in 1942 when he had to land his Folgore in the desert after running out of fuel. "It was silent out there," he said. "No sound but the wind. The stars were bright, and the Folgore was glowing faintly in the moonlight. I thought, this is the most beautiful thing man has ever made, and I am alone with it." Such testimonies reveal why the Folgore remains such a powerful symbol. It wasn't just admired, it was loved. In an age when war machines were often brutal and utilitarian, the Italian fighter was something else entirely, a creation of passion. Allied pilots, too, remembered it with respect. British ace Neville Duke, who flew almost every major fighter of the war, later wrote that the Folgore was one of the most delightful aircraft ever built to fly. He admired its harmony, its balance, and the way it felt in the air. American pilots who examined captured examples at Wright Field described it as the best handling Axis fighter below 20,000 feet. Yet behind that admiration lay melancholy. The Folgore story is inseparable from Italy's tragedy, a nation whose creativity and courage were undone by poor leadership and industrial weakness. The same factories that built the elegant Folgore were later reduced to rubble. The same pilots who once embodied national pride were scattered or forgotten. In a broader sense, the Folgore tells us something about the nature of war itself. It reminds us that beauty and destruction can coexist, that human beings, even in times of madness, still strive for perfection. The engineers who built the Folgore were not thinking of ideology. They were thinking of flight, of balance, of the dream of conquering the sky. And for a brief, brilliant moment, they succeeded. Today, when visitors walk through aviation museums and stand before the remaining Folgores, they often notice how small the aircraft is. It looks fragile compared to modern jets. The cockpit seems impossibly tight, the wings delicate. But that small frame once held men who defied the odds, who fought in burning skies, who gave meaning to a nation's fading hope. One of the most moving restorations took place in Italy itself. In the early 2000s, a team of volunteers began restoring a C.202 that had lain wrecked for decades in a farmer's field near Foggia. The aircraft had been shot down in 1944, its pilot killed instantly. The villagers had hidden the wreckage from scavengers out of respect. When the restoration was complete, the aircraft was placed in a museum, not as a symbol of war, but as a tribute to courage and craftsmanship. During the unveiling, an elderly man who had been a child during the war touched the wing and whispered, "The lightning has returned." It is this emotional power that sets the Folgore apart from other aircraft of its time. It was not the most powerful, not the most advanced, but it touched people's hearts. Even those who fought against it could not deny its elegance. For Italy, the Folgore became a bridge between defeat and rebirth. It showed that, even in chaos, the Italian spirit, inventive, artistic, and proud, could still shine. The same design philosophy that produced the Folgore would, in the years to come, give birth to some of the world's most admired creations, from sleek automobiles to elegant architecture. In this sense, the lightning never truly faded. It changed form. Every generation that rediscovers the Folgore finds something new in it. For historians, it's a case study in wartime innovation. For engineers, it's an example of aerodynamic purity. For artists, it's an icon of beauty born amid despair. And for pilots, real or aspiring, it is a dream, the embodiment of what flight is supposed to feel like. If you close your eyes and imagine it, the hum of the engine, the shimmer of heat over desert sand, the sun glinting off the polished fuselage, you can almost see it again. The Italian lightning, cutting through the sky, proud and defiant. As the decades passed, the Macchi C.202 Folgore became more than a fighter plane. It became a symbol of redemption, a reminder that even a nation in chaos could create something transcendent. For Italy, the Folgore story was not one of victory, but of dignity. It stood for the belief that excellence could still exist in defeat, and that beauty could emerge even from the ashes of war. The aircraft's survival into the modern age is itself a small miracle. Out of the more than 1,000 C.202s built during the war, only a handful escaped destruction. Some were scrapped for metal, others left to rust in hangars or deserts. Yet a few survived, preserved by enthusiasts, forgotten in storage, or restored with devotion decades later. Each remaining Folgore carries its own history, its own scars, its own whispers of the men who once flew it. In the 21st century, the Folgore enjoys renewed recognition among historians and aviation experts. Documentaries, restoration projects, and flight simulations have brought its legend back to life for new generations. It has become a favorite subject for model builders and aviation artists who are drawn to its flowing lines and elegant proportions. On internet forums and exhibitions, enthusiasts still debate the subtle differences between early and late production models. The curvature of the spinner, the angle of the radiator, the tint of the canopy glass. But behind every technical detail lies a story of humanity, of hands, hearts, and hopes. In the small Italian town of Varese, near the old Macchi factory, an annual commemoration still takes place to honor the engineers and pilots who created and flew the Folgore. Veterans, now few in number, once gathered there every September. They would stand beneath the replica aircraft displayed at the entrance, their eyes reflecting both pride and melancholy. Younger generations, unaware of the old pain, would ask them questions. Was it really as good as they say? One old pilot, his voice trembling with age, once answered simply, "Better, because she was ours." That phrase, "because she was ours," captures everything about the Folgore. It was not just about performance or victory, it was about identity. It was Italy, distilled into metal and motion. It embodied the country's contradictions: beauty and fragility, courage and recklessness, art and imperfection. Even now, more than 80 years after its first flight, the Folgore continues to inspire designers and dreamers. The shape of its fuselage, the balance of its proportions, the interplay of function and form, all reflect a timeless philosophy of design. The aircraft looks fast even when it stands still, as though the very air around it remembers the sound of its engine. Aviation historians often describe the Folgore as a what-if machine. What if Italy had produced it earlier? What if its factories had been better supplied? What if its successor, the C.205 Veltro, had arrived in time to change the course of the air war? These questions will never have answers, yet they fuel the myth. The Folgore's power lies not in what it did, but in what it represented. The best of a nation, fighting against impossible odds. In the modern age, restorers and collectors around the world continue to search for surviving components. Wings, tail sections, and engines salvaged from wrecks are painstakingly reassembled. A few years ago, an ambitious project began in Italy, an attempt to build a flying reproduction of the Macchi C.202, using original blueprints and surviving parts. The team, made up of engineers, historians, and craftsmen, spent years researching Castoldi's original drawings. When the reconstructed fuselage was finally unveiled, it was not merely a mechanical achievement. It was a resurrection. When the project's lead engineer was asked why they had devoted so much time and money to rebuilding an obsolete fighter, he smiled and said, "Because the Folgore was not just a plane. It was a dream, and dreams deserve to fly again." That dream, the dream of grace in the midst of chaos, remains at the heart of the Folgore's enduring fascination. The Folgore story also reminds us of a deeper truth about human creativity. In times of war, invention is often driven by desperation. But sometimes, from that desperation comes art. The Macchi C.202 was born not in a flourishing nation, but in one on the brink of collapse. Yet its creators still pursued perfection, crafting every line as if beauty itself were a form of resistance. It is no coincidence that so many Allied pilots who fought against the Folgore later spoke of it with respect, even affection. They recognized in it something rare, the touch of artists working in a world of soldiers. "The Folgore," one British veteran wrote, "was like a sword made by a poet." That poetic quality still resonates today. In an age of digital simulations and supersonic jets, the Folgore represents a lost intimacy with flight. It belonged to a time when a pilot could feel every vibration of the engine, every shift in the wind, every tremor of the airframe. It demanded skill, finesse, and instinct, the kind of flying that modern automation has all but erased. The aircraft's very name, Folgore, meaning lightning, feels prophetic. Like a lightning bolt, its presence was brief but brilliant. It illuminated the desert sky, burned itself into memory, and then vanished. But its glow lingers in history, a reminder that even fleeting moments can define a legacy. For Italy, the Folgore stands as one of the few untainted achievements of the war, something to be remembered with pride rather than shame. It belongs to a lineage of Italian innovation that stretches from Leonardo da Vinci's flying machines to the sleek racing cars of the modern age. In that sense, it connects the nation's past and future, the art of dreaming, and the courage to make those dreams real. Visitors to the Museo dell'Aeronautica Gianni Caproni in Trento can see a beautifully restored Folgore displayed under soft lights. Its sand-yellow paint gleams faintly, its wings outstretched as if ready to take off once more. On the wall behind it, a plaque bears the words of an Italian pilot who flew it in 1942. "We knew we would not win. But when we took to the sky in the Folgore, we felt like we could." Those words summarize everything: the futility, the faith, and the fleeting joy of flight in wartime. The Macchi C.202 was not just a product of engineers and metal workers, it was the expression of a nation's soul. It turned ridicule into respect, weakness into wonder. It proved that even a small, struggling country could create something the world would never forget. When you look at the Folgore today, whether in a museum or a photograph, imagine it as it once was. Sunlight glinting off its fuselage, sand whipping around its landing gear, the roar of its engine echoing across the desert. Picture the young pilot inside, his face streaked with dust, his heart pounding, his hands gripping the controls. He knows he may not return. But for those few moments, as the aircraft climbs into the endless blue, he feels unstoppable. That was the true power of the Lightning. Not its guns, not its speed, not its victories, but the feeling it gave. The feeling that flight itself could still be beautiful, even in the darkest of times. The Folgore was born from war, but it outlived war. Its wings carried the weight of defeat, but also the spark of something immortal, the human need to rise above the earth and touch the sky. In the end, it was not just an airplane. It was a promise that even when the world is burning, lightning can still strike with grace. And when it did, over the deserts of North Africa, the world looked up and saw what Italy was truly capable of. The sky remembered. The desert remembered. And history still whispers its name. Macchi C.202 Folgore, the Italian Lightning.